After the 67 war, Israel spread the word that its occupation of Palestinian lands was the most benevolent in history. Still, the ungrateful Palestinians did not take it lying down. Those who resisted the occupation were called fidaiyin. Israel's word for them was mukharribin. I've always wondered about this word. It's what you call a naughty child in Arabic, anta mukharrib. You are a spoiler. But what I wondered, were we spoiling? Then I realized that Israel was putting things in order for us and for them, and we were spoiling it all. This was it. It took some time before we were upgraded. Eventually, when US President George Bush declared the war on terror, we graduated into being called irhabiyin, terrorists. Each and every one of us, without exception. In Israel's eyes, we are all potential terrorists. In fact, we Palestinians are all there by permission from the Israeli state. Those who carry a Palestinian passport are no different. The number on that passport remains the one assigned us by Israel and recorded in their security files and databases. Israel can, at its whim, prohibit anyone from returning home by revoking their residency. This is the state of all Palestinians now living in the Palestinian territories and East Jerusalem. We are all infiltrators, living where we are not supposed to live. I continued my drive along the serpentine wall that curved and meandered, swerving around Israeli settlements. As I drove through this altered landscape, my mind turned to the past, to the end of the 1980s and the solidarity of the First Intifada, when if one sector, say, of the taxi drivers, were punished or deprived of their rights, others would stand by them. With Oslo, much of that solidarity and the dream of an equitable society on which we hoped to build our state has vanished and is hardly remembered. The discrimination created by the Oslo Accords between the privileged and non-privileged was legislated in the interim agreement of 1995 between Israel and the PLO, where incredibly an entire section was devoted to describing different categories of VIPs and the privileges each would enjoy, all of them to be granted or withheld by Israel, depending on how our esteemed leaders behaved. In order to have peace, we need to go back to what happened in 48 and come to terms with that history. For it all started then. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians can start from 67. Those who endured occupation and those who experienced life under full Israeli rule understand Israel and the Israeli ways better than those without that experience, and so can point the way to a vision of a future of living together. There are too many roads, too many places of residence for both sides that are in close proximity to each other, too many old towns and cities adjacent to new ones, which are now divided by walls and sometimes merely by a fence that cannot possibly endure. For anyone visiting this country, it becomes quickly obvious that the preservation of the present mosaic of geographic fragmentation with sour and spiteful people living side by side is simply not viable in the long term. It is only sustainable by the exercise of force, which cannot last long. Walls would have to come down along with the barriers of prejudice, anger, and hatred. And yet, in Palestine, Israel, a new language for peace has not been developed, nor is there an attempt at creating a common culture between the two sides. Why, then, does this not happen? The simple answer is because Israel is winning, and because its people have not yet begun to pay the price for their government's policies of not seeking peace, nor have they been able to grasp that there is benefit in changing from a warlike to a peaceful stance. As long as Israel is winning, it can continue to put off attempts by the international community to enforce these laws. The veteran Israeli journalist Gideon Levy confirms this in an article he wrote for Haaretz last July. He quote, "The change won't come from within. That has been clear for a long time. As long as Israelis don't pay a price for the occupation, or at least don't make the connection between cause and effect, they have no incentive to bring it to an end," unquote. What then can be done? I would argue that we need a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, making Israel realize that the hiatus in the application of international law will not last forever, and that it will begin to exact an economic price. On the other, encouraging it to see the benefits it can derive from making peace. Until these two realizations come about, the Israelis, who show no signs of recovering from the euphoria of victory in the detrimental war of 1967, will continue to believe what Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, declared at the time, that Israel is now an empire. Why should this empire, now the sixth biggest exporter of weapons in the world, submit to international law? They will continue on their triumphant path until, as the German expression puts it, they triumph themselves to defeat. As for Palestinians, I'm afraid that we have regressed as a nation and failed in devising a shared, sustainable self-definition. Now there is a resurgence of fragmented identities, whether based on faction, religion, clan, or class. The national definition has suffered an enormous blow. The PLO, for all its faults, was forging some common strands and providing a sense of purpose under a national banner. Now it is but a shadow of its former self. We are united by our enmity to Israel and our common history of the Nakba, but not by social cohesion, public spiritedness, or values expressed in legislative instruments that define a way of life for our society.